I'm sorry, some of it is going to be a repetition, but you can, if you were at last night's party and you might be a little sleepy, you can take a short nap. But I will be, since this is a bit more time, I will be elaborating a little bit more than what I was able to do on that day. So what I propose to do today is, first of all, very briefly, a little bit of loss of appetite, which is on the current model of development and what it means. After that, I'll move into a little bit more pleasing things, which are looking at the kinds of alternative initiatives that people are actually practicing or trying out in various parts of India, but also some other parts of the world. I'll then look at how those grassroots initiatives, what kind of larger conceptual visions that are emerging from that, which could be frameworks of alternative transformation, replacing the current model of development. I will just raise a few questions which can become part of the discussion if you feel that those questions are important. And then at the end, I'll talk about a particular process that Aili mentioned, which I'm involved with, called the Alternatives Confluences, and propose a global confluence also. So, very briefly, the way we look at development in India, as I guess across the world, especially if you happen to be a victim of that development, whether you are a forest, or you are a tiger in that forest, or you are an indigenous person who is eking out his or her living in that forest, or anywhere else with a natural ecosystem, or a farmer who's able to feed his or her own family on a piece of land, or a fishing community whose water is being threatened by a dam, and so on and so forth. You will, for us, it's this process of what is called development is violence. It is characterized as violence, and it's actually economic growth in that sense is a form of cancer for the earth and for all of us. It's also a form of violence against each one of us individually. Well, one of the most interesting things with modernity, and yesterday's conversations already brought that to us sharply, is about how we're moving from what were, and in many places, parts of the world still are, livelihoods, which is not jobs. Livelihoods is different from jobs. Livelihoods is about life, it's about culture, it's about work, it's about everything put together, into a lot of the modern sector being such where we are basically just pawns in a larger game that corporates and governments are playing, where we are a small part of the production system. Most people, for instance in India, if you speak to most people who are in the burgeoning IT, information technology industry, they are very tired of the jobs that they're doing, because they're not actually, it's not a fun, productive kind of task. So many of them are looking for ways out. And I characterize that as a movement from livelihoods to deadlihoods. We are living deadening jobs or deadening lives. And finally, well, not finally, and the other interesting thing, of course, also with this model of development is that it is across the world creating more and more inequalities. So that's an incredible figure right there, about 42 billionaires owning more than 50% of the wealth of the world. In India, it has gone up from, just in the last 15-20 years, from about 1% of India owning about 40%, now owning more than 60% of its wealth. So the inequalities are just sharply rising, which is what enables the world's largest single family house to be situated in the middle of Mumbai, where 40% of its population does not have decent housing. That's India's richest man and his single family house up there, 27 stories. And finally, and Berta's murder reminds us very sharply about this, that this model of development and growth at all costs is actually also squeezing democracy around the world, whether it's in terms of the rise in right-wing governments, parties taking over, the impunity of corporations across the world, or it's in terms of how people like us are labeled more and more as anti-development, anti-national, terrorist, and so on and so forth. In India, we're seeing this all the time, or it's in the form of people just being killed. I think 2017 was when this figure came out of more than 4 environmental defenders a week being killed across somewhere in the world. So, the question that arises is, are there alternatives? Or are we stuck with Margaret Thatcher's famous dictum, Tina, there is no alternative. But in order to answer that, I think the most important thing is to look at alternatives to what. I think it was yesterday, day before, somebody mentioned that if we are talking about shifting from, let's say, fossil fuel based cars to electric cars, is that the alternative? Or in India, for instance, we still produce incredible amounts of waste, but more and more governments and NGOs are saying, let's recycle it. Is that the alternative? Or is it, do we need the private car in the first place? Why do we produce that waste in the first place? And what are the structures that are actually forcing us or inciting us or encouraging us to actually lead those kinds of lifestyles? And so I characterize that in somewhat simplistic ways as the concentration of power to take decisions in the hands of corporations in capitalism, in the hands of states in statism, state-dominated regimes, including state socialism, in the hands of men in patriarchy across the world, probably the oldest form of inequality, in the hands of certain castes in India, certain races, certain ethnicities, and of course in the hands of human beings vis-a-vis other species. Oops, anthropocentrism is missing there, it should be there. So if one is talking about alternatives, we need to be talking about those that challenge these structures of power, the concentrations of power, and provide alternative systems and processes for that. Which then means that the kind of solutions that are being given to us from within the system right now, the solutions to climate, for instance, in terms of carbon trading or techno fixes or geoengineering, all kinds of incredibly crazy things that are being proposed, or even actually the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, are just, they are more ameliorative, they're like band-aids, they're not really going to be fundamentally solving the problems. They do not challenge these structures of the power, of the concentration of power. And so we need to look for really transformative systemic alternatives. We've been having discussions in the last couple of days on this, and I'd like to elaborate a little bit more on this, especially with a view from India. To my mind, resistance, and again remembering Berta, is very much part of these alternatives. Because firstly, it enables us to slow down the kind of juggernaut, the bulldozer of development, at least in places where people are successful in stopping. For instance, this is a movement from about 30 years back of indigenous people who fought against 2 hydroelectricity projects and stopped them in central India. They were never built. And secondly, also because these movements tend to show to us that there are other ways of looking at the world, not just looking at it from the kind of developmentalist, growth-oriented mindset that we have. That people look at forests, again, as we heard so eloquently from the memorial to Berta, of the river as being the mother, or us belonging to the land rather than the land belonging to us. This iconic movement in southern India, for instance, against the United Kingdom-based mining corporation, interestingly enough called Vedanta, which wanted to do mining in that habitat, and their argument was that who are we to give you permission to do mining here? The land doesn't belong to us, it belongs to Niyam Raja, that's their deity. So go and ask him. And it's a way of looking at it, or going back to this where these people said, the river for you is 1,000 megawatts, for us it's our mother. We will never give up our mother for what you want to do here. So it's different ways of looking at the world, and I think that's a very powerful part of the alternative. But we also need to find ways in which people's needs are met. There are real life deprivations across the world, especially the global south, of whether it's to do with basic needs of food and water and energy and so on, or it's to do with learning opportunities or health opportunities or opportunities for self-governance or gender equality, etc. So one of the things we've been doing in the last few years is to document initiatives around India where in fact people are managing to meet the needs and aspirations and achieve greater justice and equality in all kinds of different ways, which do not trash the earth and which do not cause the kind of injustice and inequalities that the current model of development does. I'm going to give a few examples of these, but before that I would also like to say that of course this is happening all over the world. We've heard of some examples from yesterday, the day before, but there's many more out there. which tell us that this is a global phenomenon. It's small, it's still marginal compared to the bulldozer of development that I spoke about, but it's a global phenomenon and we need to pay much more attention to it, and I'll come back to that in a bit. I love this map because for me it's an extremely decolonizing way of looking at the world. Following up from what Rosalba was talking about decoloniality yesterday. And first, because it actually is the true sizes of the continents, unlike the so-called normal map where Europe is shown to be huge, much bigger than it actually is. And like I said therefore yesterday, England disappears here, you don't see it anymore. But also, of course, because I just wanted to point out to a large number of other initiatives around the world which are also in some sense pointing to radically different ways of dealing with the earth and of dealing with each other and of creating human happiness without, like I said, trashing the earth. Obviously we don't have the time to go into all of these, but there's been some discussion on some of these already since the last couple of days. Quickly, a few examples from some parts of India. This is for me a very, very inspiring example where Dalit women farmers, that is farmers who are belonging to the most oppressed sections of Indian society in caste terms and in gender terms, and very small scale farmers, have mobilized themselves, have collectivized themselves over the last 30 years or so to bring back their traditional seeds of different kinds of crops, to go completely into organic farming, to collectivize their farming operations, to create grain banks for helping each other, to create credit systems, to link up with consumers in nearby towns, and to create also their own public distribution system, especially for the poorest parts of the villages, families of the villages, and through that transform a situation where there was hunger and lack of livelihood security in their houses to one where they have complete food sovereignty right now, total control over their food, adequate amounts of food, livelihood security, creating their own community media station so that they run a radio and a filmmaking unit, making their own school, and lots of other things. And through all of that, actually transforming their status as women and as Dalit, the so-called oppressed caste, and as small farmers, in ways that are now enabling them much, much more dignity and much more respect in villages. Another example which is interesting to me, and I'll come back to this in terms of sort of new politics that we're talking about, is an experiment that ran for about 10-12 years where 65 villages which were part of a watershed of a river called the Arvari, they got together and they decided that we want the river basin to be our political unit of decision making, not the conventional boundaries that have been imposed on us. And they ran that experiment, so representatives from every one of these 65 villages would get together to look at how the entire river basin should be governed and planned, and from a perspective of being ecologically sustainable, equitable, and so on. Very, very interesting experiment. A third example is from central India, which has inspired, it's a small village of indigenous people, but it's inspired similar movements in many parts of India where these people were part of the same anti-dam agitation whose picture I showed you earlier. And since then they have actually been saying that in our village, we are the government. Nobody else will take decisions for us. Only we, and that is to say the entire village assembly, all the adults, all the children also join in, but the women and the men will collectively and through consensus take decisions on whatever has to happen in the village. And about 4 years back, they also took the decision that all the private land of the village would be put into the village commons. Very, very, in many senses, a revolutionary decision that was taken. We find, of course, similar movements happening elsewhere in the world. So the struggles for indigenous territory and autonomy, I think some of you are probably more familiar with this example than I am, which was, I think, from 2 years back, where finally the claim for autonomy was recognized by the government. But even if it's not recognized, the point that indigenous peoples are making is that in our territories, we are the ones who should be governing and not our nation-state governments. Or, of course, if you look at the Zapatista or the Kurdish Rojava experiment, there's so many around the world of this striving for autonomy. Thousands and thousands of examples of where communities are conserving their territories, their ecosystems, either in traditional ways, sustaining that, or in new ways. asserting that they would be the ones who will be protecting the wildlife, the biodiversity, the forest, the other ecosystems, and through that enabling more secure livelihoods for themselves. We also have movements happening in cities in different parts of the world. This is an interesting example from Western India, the region of Kutch, extremely dry, where several colonies, especially colonies of poor people, have mobilized themselves to do much more self-governance, to become self-reliant in things like water and energy and housing, and assert that when it comes to the planning of the city and the management of the city, they should be central decision makers, not bureaucrats and politicians sitting in the municipal corporations. And of course, again, I've already mentioned these, but we find so many such examples around the world. I've already mentioned the Zapatista and the Kurdish, the movements for municipalization. Barcelona is a very interesting example. I should mention at this stage, by the way, that I'm not suggesting that any of these examples are perfect. All of them have their own issues and problems and weaknesses, but they all are in some way or the other pointing to us a different direction in which we can move. Similarly, many examples of economic transformations, of people creating much more economic democracy, whether it is workers taking over factories and running them democratically. 2 years back or 3 years back, I was in Greece, in Thessaloniki, visited Viome, the factory which has been taken over by workers, and it's run completely democratically. Every worker gets the same wage for every hour of work. And the big slogan on the factory is, "We have no boss." And many, many other such economic transformations that we see here in Europe: social and solidarity economy, the transition movement, many others. To my mind, I think the most important transformation that needs to take place is at the level of our learning institutions, because that's where the generations that are being born, which are going to be governing tomorrow, where all of us have been, in some senses, we've all gone through these institutions. At least in India, I know that these are institutions that are extremely deadening, they are uncreative, they completely crush the innovation and creativity in children, and they create essentially, if you know, some of you know Pete Seeger's songs of little boxes. So each of us is created as a little box to fit neatly into the system. But we have, of course, all sorts of alternative institutions and processes of learning where it's the reverse, where in fact the innovative, the creativity, the fun, how to become a more responsible human being, how to do things with cooperation and not competition, etc., is what is taught. I don't have Finland up here. Somebody has been telling me that Finland has a very, very interesting education system about which I'd love to learn more, and that it's threatened currently by the current regime. But once I learn more about it, I'd put it up there if it is an alternative. And just to remind ourselves, I love going back into the origins of words. So the origin of the word school is from the Greek skole, which meant leisure. Now, certainly in India, schools are not leisure. That's the last thing you can think of. But we have to, there's so many. I mean, radical, for instance. People say, why do you talk radical? Radical is extremist, it's terrorist, etc. And I have to remind people that radical simply means going to the roots, which is a good thing, right? So movements for technological democracy, where technologies are not controlled by and developed for the profits of corporations and governments, but for the benefit of people at large, and which are ecologically sustainable, or alternative forms of media, communications, arts. Again, in a country like India, where the media gets more and more captured by either the corporations or by the government, we have to find alternative means by which what we think is the truth is enabled to come out and to reach people. So many examples of that also. Now, I want to put all of this together into what I think is some kind of a larger conceptual framework that's emerging of what an alternative could be. And the way we've been looking at it in India is to see 5 interconnected spheres of life where these sorts of transformations are taking place. If you remember the village in central India which said that in our village we are the government, even as we elect the government in Mumbai and New Delhi, that's pointing to a different form of democracy than what we have across the world, which is a representative, election-based democracy, whereas what they're saying is that they're talking about radical, direct people's democracy, which in fact is, again, the original meaning of the word democracy is power of the people, not power of those we elect, right? Starting from those basic units of direct democracy, how do you then build more accountable, more eco-region based, for instance, the example going back to the river basin in Western India, more eco-region based, more culture based units of decision making right from the local to the global, which then also means that we need to start rethinking even nation state boundaries and start thinking about more borderless worlds, which was the case till 200 years or 300 years back, where people were moving all over the world. And now, of course, we all need visas, and some of you know the difficulty I had getting a visa to come here. So can we start rethinking even political boundaries from ecological, cultural perspectives? The second part of it is economic democracy. So when the women of tech and development society say we want food sovereignty, they are declaring economic democracy. They are saying that for things that are part of our economy and that we depend on for our economic needs, we should be in control, or we should at least be centrally part of the decision-making process. That's also what the workers in Viome factory are saying. We don't want a capitalist boss. We can run these businesses ourselves and run them democratically. So economic democracy is about that. It's also about deglobalization, economic deglobalization, much more self-reliance in the localities where we are, and many other things. We also then have the sphere of social justice and well-being. There's clearly political democracy and economic democracy will not work as long as we also have gender inequalities and caste inequalities and the kind of social injustices, some of which have come to us from many thousands of years back, many of which are being created in the new systems. So the struggles for social well-being and justice. And also, what is well-being? I don't use the word development anymore. So sustainable development to me is an oxymoron. It does not, it's a contradiction in terms. But well-being, okay, so what is it that makes us happy, satisfied, etc., etc.? We need to sort of rethink or bring back a lot of the old notions or rethink new ones. The fourth sphere there is of cultural diversity and knowledge democracy. All the examples that I've mentioned are examples where people have put different knowledge systems together, where they have respected cultural diversity, where they feel that, for instance, the local language system or the local food system is as important as anything that we might be getting from outside. Where you go back to Gandhi's famous saying that he said, I have no problems, I would like to open up the windows and doors of my house to the winds of all cultures to flow freely through, but I refuse to be blown off my feet by any of those winds. Which is to say, I stay rooted in my cultural and ecological system, but I'm really glad to be interacting with and learning from other cultures and societies. And the last sphere, of course, is ecology, because like I said the other day, without that we're all dead. One of the most interesting questions I ask my audiences every time is, what's the thing without which we can't live for more than 2 minutes? Oxygen, right? How many people here know where oxygen comes from? Most oxygen of the world. Most people say trees or the Amazon. Not true. Marine algae. Yeah. Algae growing in the seas. Almost nobody has ever been taught that. You know, I mean, the thing without which we can't live for more than 2 minutes, and we don't know where it comes from, most of us. So anyway, that's a small example of the importance of ecology, of ecological wisdom. But at the core of all of this flower of transformation is really that blue circle there of values. And to me, that's the most important part of any of this. If we go back to thinking of this as an Indian dish, what's the recipe? What's the dish that's emerging? So we call it Eco-Swaraj, radical ecological democracy. It's a very interesting idea, and just to go back to the origins of words, as I said, the word radical means going to the roots. It doesn't mean extremist, and you shouldn't be imprisoned for using it. Very simple concept, that wherever we are part of decision making. Democracy means power at the level of the people, but that decision making, that power is exercised with ecological responsibility and social responsibility, so that the ideas of justice and equality and sustainability and all of that are built into that decision making process. And where then the most important unit of decision making is the community, whatever form of collective we're thinking about, whether it's a school or a college or a village or a town neighborhood or whatever, and not the government, the centralized state nor the private corporation. Just to quickly go into the word Swaraj, this is a concept from India which is very, very ancient, which is autonomy and freedom, but in responsibility to others' autonomies and freedoms, which means that there's a sense of rights and responsibilities that's built into it. There's a sense of saying, okay, I need to examine myself in my own life in order to make sure that I'm not impinging on or undermining somebody else's life. So it's a deeply spiritual but also a very political way of looking at the world. And there are similar worldviews elsewhere. Yesterday we heard again about many of them. Suma Kause was mentioned, I think, in Berta's thing. Many others of a similar thing, many of them very ancient from indigenous peoples, some of them new, relatively new, such as ecofeminism or degrowth in Europe and so on. But if you look at it, there's some very interesting common threads running through many of them, which is really the sort of values that each of them espouse, which are so very different from the values or the lack of values that the currently dominant system tells us. So I'm just going to put this list up there. Obviously, we don't have the time to go into any of these in detail, but just to say that whether it's in our schools and learning systems, or it's the way in which we work as civil society or as governments or whatever, if we keep these sorts of values in mind, we will be going in very different directions than what our dominant system today tells us. A couple of years back, we had a youth confluence in India looking at alternative futures, and they looked at this list and they said, oh, great, fantastic, very inspiring, but too serious, so we need to add fun as a basic value. Yeah, some of us oldies need to be told this. So, the coffee. A bunch of questions I'm just going to put up there. I don't think anybody has all the answers to what this new radical alternative world would look like. Firstly, lots and lots of small examples, some of them large examples also, but how do you enable the macroeconomic and political change on the basis of these? That can be very much part of the discussion. Who would take the lead towards this? Is it mass movements? Is it political parties? I don't think so. Is it NGOs? I don't think so. So who is it? Is it like mass movements, but then which kind of mass movements? Workers' movements, farmers' movements, students' movements, etc. Will there be a state, a centralized state? If not, what is the notion of governance across the globe? If not the United Nations, which is based on nation states, what is the form of global governance of people's assemblies, etc.? Is there a business sector, and would it be private or would it be community owned? And then what does it mean for us as academics or researchers or even activists in terms of looking at cutting up, breaking down the boundaries between different knowledge systems and disciplines and so on. So one of the processes that we run in India, and then I'm going to end, is where we try and bring together movements, networks, organizations that are working on these sorts of different alternatives and also part of resistance, to learn much more from each other, to collaborate more, to especially learn across sectors, because you have, like for instance, the sustainable agriculture folks are getting together frequently, but they don't necessarily get together with people who are working on health, who don't necessarily get together with people who are working on political governance or gender or whatever. So actually cutting across sectors, trying to enable much more learning and collaboration, and through that also visioning process. So these are actual physical confluences where people meet for 3 or 4 days and do all kinds of serious and fun activities. And then together, collectively, over the last 4 years, we've also been coming up with the larger framework for what is an alternative way of looking at the world, which is an ongoing, evolving note on alternatives. And also then kind of putting this together in terms of visions for the future, utopian visions for the future. So this is a book that some of us, about 40 of us, put together last year, the one on the left, which is really exercise in daydreaming. It's saying, okay, forget about reality and practicality for the moment and just say, okay, what's my utopian vision? If I'm a gender activist, or if I'm community health activist, or if I'm a researcher working on education, what is my dream future for India in 2100? And then coming back to the current context and saying, okay, how do I get there? What are the challenges? What are the examples already available which point us in that direction? The second book on the right, and that's one of the books that we will be talking about in the book session immediately after this, is 110 examples from around the world, very short essays of radical alternatives, including many of those that I had put up on that map. So please do come for the book event if you are interested. That second book is not yet published, but we'll be talking about it and distributing a circuit. There is also a flyer out there on the desk, so which you can pick up. It should be available within the next couple of months. We have also come up with a more of a sort of a study tool, which I'd be happy to share, where any of these initiatives that is taking place can look at itself from a more holistic perspective. So suppose, for instance, I am doing sustainable farming, like the Women of Tech and Development Society. I can use this to see, okay, how am I doing on the political front, the cultural front, the ecological front, the economic front, etc. Am I transforming positively and radically in all these, or am I maybe being contradictory? So I'm doing fantastic forest conservation work, but actually it's all controlled by men, so I'm actually being regressive in a social sense. So it's really a tool. It's not a top-down tool that I can go as a researcher and examine community, but I as a researcher can work with the community to help in doing this. And through that, then the dialogue that emerges can enable further, more holistic transformation. I'd be happy to share this to anybody who wants this. And finally then, emerging from the example of the Vikalp Sangam in India or the Crianza Mutua in Mexico and many others, we have proposed, since the last 5-6 months now, we have proposed and have started preparing for what we now call the global tapestry of alternatives, trying to see can we enable exchanges and collaboration amongst all the different fantastic things that are happening around the world, so that we can become a greater political mass. We can actually influence the macro system much more than if we were just isolated initiatives around the world. We've had some initial discussions on that in the last 2 degrowth meetings last year, and many more are coming up, including in the World Social Forum meeting on transformative economies in Barcelona early April. Last, people look at this and hear me and say, well, yeah, this is all fine, but it's impossible. This is a utopia. And yes, it is utopia. But I love this statement from the Argentinian film director Fernando Birri, quoted by Eduardo Galeano. Utopia is on the horizon. I move 2 steps closer. It moves 2 steps further away. I walk another 10 steps and utopia runs 10 steps further away. As much as I may walk, I never reach it. So what's the point of utopia? The point is this: it makes us continually advance. At least we have some directions in which we can head. Thank you very much.